Hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, and night to everyone, depending on where you might be. Welcome to UCLA Center for South India and South Asia Speaker Series. My name is Bharat Venkat, and I'm a faculty member at UCLA's Institute for Society and Genetics, as well as in the Department of History. I'm a co-organizer of the series, along with Professor Anna Morcombe and the director of our center, Professor Akhil Gupta. Before we proceed with today's talk, I'd like to take a moment to note that the Center for India and South Asia at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land takers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relations, past, present, and emerging. Before I introduce our speaker, a bit of housekeeping. After today's talk, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. If you have a question, please do send me a message directly, and we'll attempt to unmute you and turn on the video so that you can ask your question directly. I ask that you keep your questions short, so please avoid the comment and focus on really asking a concise question. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Anjali Arondekar. Anjali is Associate Professor of Feminist Studies and founding co-director of the Center for South Asian Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research interests include the poetics and politics of sexuality, caste, and historiography, with a focus on Indian Ocean studies and South Asia. She is the author of For the Record, on Sexuality and the Colonial Archive in India, which came out with Duke University Press in 2009, and subsequently in an Indian edition with Orient Black Swan in 2010. This book was the winner of the prestigious Modern Language Association's 2010 Alan Bray Memorial Book Award for Best Book in Lesbian, Gay, or Queer Studies in Literature and Cultural Studies. She is also the co-editor with Geeta Patel of a special issue of GLQ entitled Area Impossible, The Geopolitics of Queer Studies. Her second book, Abundance, Sexuality, Historiography, Geopolitics, is forthcoming with Duke and grows out of her interest in the figurations of sexuality, caste, and capital in colonial British and Portuguese India. Her talk today is entitled Hum Kaagaz Nahi Dikhayenge, Caste, Sexuality, Protest. Please join me in welcoming Professor Anjali Arondekar.
Thank you, Bharat, for that very generous introduction. And Jai Bhim to all of you who are here today. I want to thank Bharat, Anna, Akhil, and a big salamat to Jamaica, who's taken very good care of me. I also want to extend a big thank you to all of you who are here sharing your time and company with me in these extraordinary and extenuating times of grief, horror, rage, and solidarity. What I'd like to do is dedicate my talk to the memory of Comrade Mahavir Narwal, the father of political prisoner Natasha Narwal, who died tragically of COVID, and to all other political prisoners under India's authoritarian regime. So without further ado, Hum Kaagaz Nahi Dikhayenge, Caste, Sexuality, Protest. I am not your data, nor am I your vote bank. I am not your project or any exotic museum object. I am not the soul waiting to be harvested, nor am I the lab where your theories are tested. I am not your cannon fodder or the invisible worker or your entertainment at India Habitat Center. I am not your field, your crowd, your history, your help, your guilt, medallions of your victory. So I draw my own picture and invent my own grammar. I make my own tools to fight my own battle. For me, my people, my world, and my Adivasi self. So writes Abhay Khaka, an Adivasi scholar, activist, artist. What I read is an excerpt from a longer poem entitled I Am Not Your Data, published in 2011. In what remains in my mind, one of the most militant and poignant tracks of anti-caste aestheticism and politics. Khaka, a member of the Kuruk tribe, born and brought up in Jaspur district, Chhattisgarh, died tragically of a heart attack of non-COVID related reasons on March 2020, and was a personal hero of mine. someone I had the fortune to meet in person at an Ambedkar gathering in Mumbai in 2019. Kaka was a stalwart of Adivasi land reform and more specifically an intellectual who pushed for radical imaginaries that would combat the datafication and dehumanization of his Adivasi and Dalit Bahujan kin. If one motif hums through his poem, it is the pressing, almost unbearable awareness of the privations of caste and the unction of history, as if to say, between who we are and how we are seen lies an unbridgeable metrics, an archive of algorithmic violence that won't let us breathe. So I draw my own picture and invent my own grammar, he writes in his limpid litany of refusals, exhorting us, his readers, to imagine vibrant historical vernaculars for Adivasi and Dalit Bahujan presence. A clear tribute, I might add, to Dr. Ambedkar's insistence on caste as a theoretical calculus and vocabulary that endures. Now, for the past decade or so, I have returned often to Kaka's trenchant exhortations to think through my own intellectual discomfort with the evidentiary regimes that secure pathways to histories of caste and sexuality, to think about what it means to not be data, fodder for a knowledge supply chain that sees our histories only through lineages of loss, erasure, and paucity. Instead, I have turned to the concept metaphor of abundance as a heuristic to summon a non-recuperative history of sexuality and caste that embraces presence without return or the fear of loss. To summon a history of abundance for me is not to be restored to value, but rather to be set adrift upon more intrepid economies of meaning, sometimes harmonious, sometimes dissonant, that come together to upend genealogies of historical recuperation and representation. Through my research on a Dalit Bahujan Devadasi community, the Gomantat Maratha Samaj, I have encountered instead archives of invention, thriving ecosystems of protest, refusal, and pleasure. As some of you here who have heard me speak about the Samaj before know, the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, or the Gomantak Kalavan Samaj, as it is also known, is a historical anomaly and rarity, both in its archival forms and content. Let me add here that the Maratha in the Gomantak Maratha Samaj has a very different lineage than the Maratha debates we see now in Maharashtra in terms of caste, and I'm happy to say more about that anon. Moving between British and Portuguese India, spread across the border states of Maharashtra, Goa, and Karnataka, the Samaj is the only Devadasi collectivity with over 100,000 registered members that has maintained its own continuous archive since its inception in 1927 till today, embracing rather than disavowing its history of caste and sexuality. Its archives in Mumbai, Panaji, and Hubli are accessible and available to all that care to enter, a radical, almost counterintuitive project for anyone who has done archival research in India, and are full of the minutiae of subaltern life, an efflorescent and heady melange of fact and fiction with archival genres that corrupt and stage verifiability in the form of fake birth certificates, property deeds, and more. A canny archival pragmatism founds these collections, where the sheer abundance of the materials is less an organizing than a disorganizing force, shot through by questions of pleasure, practice, and subjectivity, agency, and ethics. Now, A second notable feature of this collectivity is their shifting caste recognition under uneven state laws, guided primarily through confusing and muddled legislation around Devadasi communities. Moving between the nominalizations and categorizations of Dalit and OBC in Maharashtra, Goa, and Karnataka, the Samaj's history speaks directly to the biopolitics of caste and sexuality, as striated and pliable, less a place of certitude than a signature of persistent unverifiability, where the data for who qualifies as an oppressed caste remains porous, even arbitrary. The current furor, as I noted, over the Maratha quota in Maharashtra, being a good example. Such mediated caste knowledges further undergird the very judicial characterization of caste materialized in the language of rights and representation, where we become data. I tick the box OBC as reserve, even as caste and sexual violence remain unabated. That is, caste remains an effect of systematic state, Brahminical class, and gendered power. And yet, we are summoned to identify with the very forms that have produced our minoritization in the first place. Any robust anti-caste scholarship, in my mind, thus requires a balancing act between these two translations of caste, and one would add sexuality, one more fluid and the other sedimented in the language of the state. Now, I grew up within the bawdy, colorful, and expansive lower caste politics of this Gomantat Maratha Samaj. And it is these familial genealogies that first opened me up to the urgencies of caste, sexuality, and politics. My deliberations today thus emanate from those intimacies. They are of them, but not about them. Contravening the protocols of data collection, be they of collectivity, family, caste, was not just a familiar feature of my Samaj life, but a profoundly political matter. One's history was not a place of capture. It was a compositional lexicon of self-making, to be continuously taught, modulated, inhabited, and shed. To return to Kaka again, I can thus do no better than to tell you that story. In what follows, I want to suture Kaka's call for new idioms of protest, refusal, and survival to the Samaj's history of caste and sexuality, and proffer two sightlines of epistemic and material protest. First, I want to ask, how can a history of sexuality, such as that of the Samaj, potentialize non-evidentiary futures for Dalit Bahujan subjects? How can such histories clog up the data stream, so to speak, on boats of our own archival making? What happens if we draw pictures, craft verse, hold memories of worlds that are wondrously defiant and efflorescent? And secondly, what happens if we turn to a theorization of radical caste politics, of Dalit Bahujan imaginaries, as Andolan protest visions that cull the impossible and creative force of the Bahu, the majority of lower caste subjects? Annihilation remains the horizon, attenuation our historical task. To do so, for me, is to shift the understanding of Dalit Bahujan away from its overdetermined connections to electoral politics, or to the establishment of Bahujan-based parties, or to move away from the divisions between Kanshiram and Dr. Ambedkar, or even Kancha Ilya, and to focus more on their collective potentiality as an episteme, ethics, and politics. After all, even today, the term Bahujan of Pali Buddhist lineage as Gopal Guru reminds us, refers to a lexical soup of representational diversity. Present-day scheduled castes, Dalits, scheduled tribes, Adivasi, indigenous, Shudras, other backward castes, cutting across religion, ethnicities, and geographies. While Dalit and Adivasis are some of the most vulnerable communities in a caste society, the majority of the people of the subcontinent, as we know, are caste-bound and ruled by upper caste minorities. To think of Dalit Bahujan epistemologies is to recognize that there is something untenable about caste, that to be Dalit Bahujan is also to participate violently and necessarily in a project of collective undoing, in an annihilation of caste. My meditation today has 3 scenes of reading, each an archival fragment of histories of caste, sexuality, evidence, and protest, rendered in different rhetorical keys. My ambition, for better or for worse, is necessarily diffuse, even didactic. The urgency here is to reinvent new idioms of the possible. Scene 1, I'm going to turn to Jamaica and ask her to show the first video. Scene 1 is called Kagaz Wapasi, Protest. Jamaica, would you share the first video, please? I think you need to turn the volume up. Jamaica, we can't hear. I think you need to turn the volume up. I'm sorry, we're running into Jamaica. Could you try the video again? Jamaica, sorry. Please bear with us.
I will obviously not be able to, as a trans person, produce certificates of my parents.
What is the need of this bureaucratic burden on people of India right now? It is absolutely suicidal, I would say, to be a trans person in this time, in this country right now.
Identifying as a trans woman, it is very pertinent, and we have seen that the way in which NRC has been conducted throughout Assam, a lot of trans people, actually most of them, have been thrown out of the list, and that has denied them citizenship and also put their citizenship in peril. This is bound to happen among people who have been disowned by typical ways in which families function and in typical ways in which belonging and citizenship is proven.
The trans people do not have their documents. They're still fighting for their identity with themselves, with the society. So there will be a lot of official documents, and a lot of trouble and difficulties will come within the trans community and the queer community. It's absolutely, we've been fighting this for years, and this will just worsen the effect to another level.
I will obviously not be able to, as a trans person, produce certificates of my parents, etc., whom I have not been in touch with, and that is the case with a lot of trans people around.
Trans people in particular, especially those who have a different name on our identity documents and gender compared to birth certificates, especially for in those situations, it is going to then be prohibitively difficult for transgender persons to prove legacy and relationship to parents who may have been in the country before 1971.
If you look at trans community particularly, because there is a lack of blood filial home, so we find communities in different areas. Like either trans community will join Gharana or they will find other community living. So in those cases, it's also an attack on those living. That you can either be trans by getting a certificate from district magistrate. Nobody knows how you will get it.
Therefore, what this insistence of having documents as of now, seems both completely unnecessary and completely wanting to just remove a huge chunk of population.
Thank you, Jamaica. So I just want to set up this section with two videos. That video, of course, which is taken in a very urban space and has members of our trans community talk about the challenges of kargas. The next video that I'll show, again, just a brief session to set up this section, is taken in Jamshedpur and is a video of Pasmanda Muslims, Dalit Muslims, who are talking about the onus of kargas. So Jamaica, will you show the next video, please? Thank you so much.
आके जाएंगे हम कागज नहीं दिखाएंगे, हम कागज नहीं दिखाएंगे, हम कागज नहीं दिखाएंगे। आप तुम आंसू गैस उछालोगे, तुम आंसू गैस उछालोगे, तुम जहर के चाय उबालोगे, तुम जहर के चाय उबालोगे, हम प्यार की शक्कर घोल के गट 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 पी जाएंगे। हम कागज नहीं दिखाएंगे, हम कागज नहीं दिखाएंगे। तुम जात पात से बांटोगे, हम हाथ मिलाते जाएंगे, हम कागज नहीं दिखाएंगे, हम कागज नहीं दिखाएंगे। आवाज दो, है हक हमारी, हम लेके रहेंगे, है जान से प्यारी, है हक हमारी।
Thank you. Now, that video, the second video, was shot in Jamshedpur at Pasmanda Dalit Muslim rally, which is obvious as you see the scene around you. I will return to both of these videos in what follows. Now, even as protests against the Citizens Amendment Act, NPR, and NRC raged rapidly across India at the end of 2019, till 2020 or early 2020. The last protest I attended was in Mumbai on March 15th, 2020. There was a clear sense for many of us that we were battling some familiar legal, historical, and political struggles around the linkages between evidentiary regimes and discourses of rights and representations for minoritized subjects across caste, region, labor, sexuality, and more. The chant, "Hum kagaz nahi dikhayenge," we will not show our papers, became a rousing anthem of the protest, demonstrating stridently the challenges such evidentiary regimes placed on bodies across regions, generations, and temporalities. The phrase "Hum kagaz nahi dikhayenge," as many of you here know, is taken from Varun Groval's now viral poem, and the specific paragraph reads, "Hum samvidhan ko bachayenge, hum kagaz nahi dikhayenge, hum janagana mana bhi gayenge, hum kagaz nahi dikhayenge." And for my non-speaking Hindi kin here, we will save the Constitution, we will not show papers, we will sing Jana Gana Mana, the national anthem, we will not show papers. Now, for sexuality subjects, as we have seen in the video clip where trans kin are speaking, such a demand for kagas, evidence, produced a particularly complex set of legal, ethical, and affective negotiations, as was seen in the arguments made by trans subjects vis-a-vis their continuous effacement within legal and societal structures. To produce original evidence, kagas, to prove, entre guillemets, trans lives, who we really are, was to return to familiar legal and chronological structures of self that were violent and punitive. For Dalit Bahujan kin, and the segregations of caste and sexuality are ones that I've always refused, as Suresh Yengde and Suryakant Wagmare wrote at the time, the call to documents, the verifiable or otherwise, was an acutely exclusionary judicial enactment of caste consolidation. To be legible as paper subjects was to further dehumanize Dalit Bahujan bodies already at the peripheries of the state's biopower. For example, my own mother, like so many other caste-oppressed kin in India, or like the legendary figure of Ai in my favorite Dalit Marathi poet Jyoti Lanjevar's famous corpus, has no birth certificate, only a memory of a life nourished despite the mandate of that origin story. To refuse Kagas was to forge a history of caste and sexuality that required new languages of political action. A second noteworthy development of these nationwide protests was, of course, the exuberant embrace of Dr. Ambedkar, alongside a perceptible and, in my mind, much needed sidelining of Mahatma Gandhi as national icon. The phrase preceding the chant, "Hum kagaz nahi dikhayenge," as we heard in our opening video, was the equally rousing phrase, "Hum samvidhan ko bachayenge," a direct homage to Ambedkar's constitutional legacy, his pioneering vision of a radical democracy which centered Dalit and Bahujan histories as places of learning and possibility. Now, it's very important to remember that the invocation of the Constitution, the Samvidhan here, must not be seen as a return to the idea of enshrined truths, or even a return to a paper, to an evidentiary genre maligned at the hands of an authoritarian and divisive state. Rather, the call to bachao, to save or rescue the Samvidhan, was more a call to what Kalpana Kannabiran has recently termed a constitution as commons, a space of active making and remaking, a coming together of new grammars of subject making within these protests to create what Rohit Dey so importantly reminded us has always been a people's document. The Constitution as commons is not a kagas full of verifiable data and embodied beginnings, more a vocabulary of protest and possibility. Now, in a space like South Asia, or more specifically India, where the idea of evidence is always already a hoax, a jugaad form, as we love to say, what does it then mean to both refuse and mobilize the rhetoric of kagas? Our pandemic times have further heightened these kagas regimes as citizens are both composed and decomposed through a language of evidence that arbitrarily creates insiders and outsiders, those of us who live and those of us who do not. I have returned often to these early moments of protest in these past few harrowing weeks, as the jugaad form has become both our salvation and our demise. Social media secures breath at the very moment in which the state refuses the possibility of life. Unnamed kin die in unnamed spaces, even as the register of COVID deaths and cases climbs every day. A few days ago, a trans Dalit comrade, Usha, in rural Maharashtra, in Latur, who could not get their brother into a hospital bed, wrenchingly WhatsApped me. "Kagas navte ग, म्हणून त्याचे मरण लवकर झाले. We didn't have the right papers, sister. That is why he died so prematurely." Scene 2. I just want to take a breath a little bit. Okay. Scene 2. We are Saraswats. Evidence. I will share my screen with you. Unfortunately, I don't have the image I wanted, but we'll carry on anyway. Scene 2. We are Saraswats. Evidence. September 2016. A smaller enclave of the Devadasi community that I study lives in Hubli, Karnataka, a tiny city, as many of you here know, that straddles the border between Maharashtra, Goa, and Karnataka. Here, the community is mostly categorized as Dalit or Deoli, with a few subgroupings making their way into OBC classification, on the basis of their economic success. As such, I am in Hubri to conduct archival research and to speak to some of the living elders who have wills, property deeds, and various historical memorabilia to share. On the invitation of the Samaj president, I attend their monthly function held at the Samaj headquarters in the heart of Hubri. The function is a gathering of celebration and admonition, as achievements of Kalakar members are lauded, even as the continued social and economic destitution of the community continues to be bemoaned. At this point, I am pulled into the fray by an enthusiastic older Devadasi, Nirmala Tai, who asks me to speak to my research and remind the audience of the Samaj's enduring history of caste and sexuality. Kannada or Marathi, okay, she says. And wagging her finger at me, she coquettishly adds, Namma Mahila Aru, Sundara Tare. Make sure to tell them how beautiful our women are. It is at this point, after a little bit of flirtatious banter, that I noticed the very large banner displayed prominently above the stage. A banner written in Kannada, which reads, Konkan Saraswat Samaj, Hubri Dharwad, Sanman Karekram for Shri Ram Bhandarkar, who is a Kalakar from the community. Konkan Saraswat Samaj is what the banner reads. Baffled at what I conclude is surely a mistake, or at least an aspirational typo, I turn to Nirmala Tai and ask her to explain the banner. Surely, I ask, in my typical historian, how will this appear in the archive mode? You must see how this looks. The banner, I firmly added, suggests that we are a Saraswat Samaj, a Brahmin Samaj, which is clearly not true. Without batting an eyelid and with a weary nod, Nirmala Tai looks at me and says, do you see what is next to the banner? There is the image of the goddess Saraswati, the goddess of learning. In Hubri, we are devotees of Saraswati and committed to learning, and so we are ourselves Saraswat. Ha hakka fakta brahmanansa nahi. That right does not belong to the Brahmins. Now, there is clearly so much more here to say about this interlude of caste and sexuality, which I have written about in my book, and the historical record. After all, from what we know of this Samaj's history, such caste adjustments rarely materialize economic change, but they appear throughout in the ways in which the Samaj conjures their own histories of caste and sexuality. Let me be clear, such slights of caste, if you will, are not to be read as an aspirational form, wanting to be Brahmin, attempting instead to forge an upper caste identity. That is not the point. Rather, these events are more installations of protest, of a reordering of the grammar of recognition and of lineage. After all, the Hubri Samaj repeatedly celebrates its Devadasi history. They are, as Nirmala Tai tells us, simply in search of learning. The data has been changed. Who's a Brahmin now? Now to my final scene. I think we're doing okay for time. Scene 3. We spoke to a cremator, remember. I remember you, my mother always tenderly says to my partner Lucy, as she glimpses her across oceans, virtual and real, every week. My mother is 85. Her memory folded and faded into crevices of stories told and untold. In the pixelated landscape of my video screen, Ai's words linger, a translated rendering of how she manifests absence. I remember you, Mala tuji aatwan yete, which makes aatwan, memory, an act of personal conjuring, a poignant tethering of past and present. I remember you too, Auntie, Lucy always responds, sealing a treasured ritual of long-distance love that sutures affect to a history of memory. To remember is not to grasp a lost form or surrender to the nostalgia of a less violent past, if there ever was one, but more an aspirational of relationality, to fashion a world, or at least a version of a world that brings joy, succor, and the possibility of a reunion. I have thought often of Ai's phrase this past pandemic year as I've traveled several times to Mumbai to see her without her beloved Lucy, whose US passport makes it impossible for her to enter a virus-stricken India. I have thought of what it means to remember a history lost and unseen in a country besieged by memory disputes, where little separates the factional from the fictional. Even as India buckles under the weight of rampant authoritarianism, communalism, casteism, and a general disregard for human life, I remember you. I remember the promises of liberation, the mandate to agitate, organize, and educate. I remember the farmers' protests, the words of Nodeep Kaur, the joyous rhythms of Shaheen Bagh, and the refusals of Bhima Koregaon. Today, as heartbreak stretches across India, where more fires are lit to cremate than to create, there are more memories to be made. From the searing faces of my Dalit Bahujan kin, who tend the dead in the crematorium of Hindutva making, to the oxygen langar that provides breath to the as yet living, we remember. A cremator in Delhi, at the center of India's COVID hill, the news byline reads, weeps. He is, after all, the only witness, the only record of the living dead. Ashu Rai is his name, always a Dalit, yet now the bearer of last rites, of data unprocessed, of bodies unspoken. Almost everyone asks me about my caste because everyone wants a Brahmin to do the rituals and not the Dalits. But they aren't available. We are, Rai says. Drenched in sweat, bearing wood, he takes one remaining piece of cloth, covering his face and head, and whispers laughingly, "This cloth absorbs my sweat, my body. And when I hang it on my shoulder, people think that I am a Brahmin priest. I am a Dalit. I am a record of your loss. I am not your data. I am abundant." I want to end today by returning us to the voice of Abhay Khaka. I will share a small video with you, Jamaica will begin it, which is a reading that Abhay Khaka made in Kuruks, which is a language that he worked hard to foster, an indigenous language that is, of course, like many others, in fear of extension. I will provide no translation. I want you to enjoy, embrace, and breathe. Jamaica, will you show the video, please? The third one.
इनके नाम है अभय खाखा रही और इन जवाहरलाल नेहरू यूनिवर्सिटी थी नो आदिवासी जमीन भूअधिकार मैया इन PhD नंस कदन इन छत्तीसगढ़ पूर्वी कोना जशपुर थी असने के पद्दा रही और इन आपको नोंटे कुड़ कहानी पढ़ ओंती मेंटोन कहानी इन्नरी कहानी नामेरी बांको आलस ओंटे औरत चोखास सस्रेर कालागे उर्खियास और पोटामनु जोक आसमा को अलबियास कानून तलहे एखान तिर इरियस दरा बुज्जरस और नन्ना आलस इंगे बार आस आस एखान आनियास काला भाई किर्रा इंगे ससरेर नु किरार अनार इंद्रांति ओ अंतिले जोख गेच्छा ki unghon kir irias ki bachas. I asman iyas ki eraputas. Onage untan ulias dara asan dahrenu uyas ki keras. Jonch hari kias kahane erdes a nanna anuhu bar as. Anti anyas is emba saras anage mala kirias. Aur jukin cion. Enne urmi asman kirya dara tempanu uitum keras. Onta bhagwa midhi bichirki racha. Adin hu munja nu dahre nu uyas. Aganim puttia.
Thank you for your time, your patience, and for listening. Bharat, I'm done.
Anjali, thank you so much for that talk. I think it's given all of us so much to think about and consider. At this point, I want to open it up to questions. If you have a question, please do message me directly. Then I can ask Jamaica to unmute you so you can ask your question directly.
And it would be, sorry to interrupt, it would be lovely to see your faces. This is a time of communion for me. So seeing all kinds of brown faces from everywhere would be wonderful. So if you feel comfortable, please share your beaming, joyous, live faces. Thank you, and Jai Bhim.
Perhaps while we're waiting for folks to message, could I begin by asking just a very, could you speak a bit more about the final video if you'd be willing?
Sorry, which video, Bharat?
The very last video that you showed.
Yes,
Yeah.
so I met Abhay Khaka when he was very much invested in making more representation possible for Adivasi and Dalit Bahujan kin within higher education. Abhay Khaka died tragically at 37, unable to get a position in a institution of higher learning in India. That was his biggest tragedy. So one of the projects that he was very invested in doing was writing children's books in Kuruks, which was the indigenous language that his collectivity spoke, so that Adivasi children would grow up with an episteme of themselves that was figural, allegorical, literary, and political. So that's why I wanted to end with that. And I also didn't want to provide a translation because I think that is the point.
Great, thank you. Just as a reminder, so please then go ahead and just message me via the chat function if you have a question. And I also ask again that you keep your questions kind of, as concise as possible so that we have a chance to give everybody who'd like to an opportunity to ask a question.
If you have a comment or meditation, I'm happy to hear it as well. We are keeping company, so whatever is possible. हम कागज नहीं दिखाएंगे, लेकिन हम सवाल तो पूछ सकते हैं.
So we have a first question from Shiv. So perhaps if Jamaica could unmute Shiv. Well, perhaps I can do it. There we go. Shiv, do you want to ask your question directly?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. This was really an incredible learning experience, especially in continuing to figure out what we can do to challenge casteism, not just in India, but also in the diaspora and what that looks like. My question is pertaining to how we can educate ourselves more, and especially within universities, because I didn't quite get the opportunity to dismantle and agitate and challenge casteism much in my university experience. So I'm wondering, what would that look like, especially in a way that doesn't further re-traumatize or depend on the re-traumatization of Dalit Bahujan, because oftentimes that education is best represented from Dalit Bahujans, not upper caste folks who want to try to either imitate or speak on behalf of Dalit Bahujans. So where's the, what would that even look like in like a university setting? Because I didn't quite experience that, and I'm curious what that would look like.
Thank you for your question, Shiv. And I will say there are two ways in which to address this. And I am involved with, I think maybe some people here, in a project with Equality Labs, where we are working very hard to make caste a protected category. And the Cal State system has just voted on. I am working with a group in the UC system to make that happen as well. And of course, this was made possible by the bravery of Dalit kin, who filed a class action suit against Cisco, which has opened the conversation for many of us that we have already been having. And if you are wanting to learn, I would say you should listen to the recordings of the Santa Clara Human Rights Commission, at which 600 of us or more gave testimony. And what was wondrous was to hear the range of testimonies, but was equally sort of traumatizing, to use your word, was to hear the testimonies of those from the other side. There was a gentleman who said, well, obviously I'm not casteist because I don't call a Dalit when I need to flush my toilet. These were said in a Human Rights Commission testimony, right? So if there is any doubt for anyone here in the audience that caste does not exist in the United States or in the diaspora, let me deprive you of that phantasmatic orientation. So there are very strategic, clear ways, depending on how much time and energy you have, but there are also intellectual ways in which you do caste, which is what my project is as well, is to insist on the centrality of caste as an episteme, not primarily through the logic of representative politics, but as a modality of securing meaning. And that is what I have done in my work on the Gomantat Maratha Samaj. It is a way of asking questions about our forms of meaning making. In India, of course, the question of caste is modulated around the challenge of reservations, right, which has been described regionally in very different ways, but the recent refusal of elite institutions like the IIT to, allow, they want to reduce the reservation quotas because the argument, of course, as always, is around a false meritocracy. So I think there is lots of ways in which one can agitate, educate, and organize. But I think it's important to think about what your forms of expertise are. That's why I am so drawn to Abhay Khaka's work. He spoke very poignantly of higher education. He spoke very poignantly of why we need to intervene in the epistemological imaginaries of the worlds we inhabit, not just prove that we exist through our numbers, through our bodies. And I think for me that has remained, and again, this is an Ambedkarite project as well, but this is also a project that queer trans activists and queer scholars have been making. So that's why I want to sort of think about caste and sexuality as constitutive, because oftentimes we have weird hierarchicalizations of oppression. Remember, the authoritarian state uses the language of sexuality to prove a refuge, right? So we have the walking down of Section 377, the problematic NALSA, but that does not mean the lives of trans queer people are getting better, on the contrary. So it's really important for us to keep both of them in conversation and collaboration so that we don't reproduce the segregations that the state will want us to do, right? That Devadasis are not queer. Devadasis are bio women. That is nonsense, right? It's about a non-recuperative, non-reproductive politics, and that's what we need to attend to. Sorry, I've gone on and given you a bhashan, which you did not ask for. My apologies. I get very carried away.
So our next question is from Sagnik Saha. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question directly?
Hello. I just have one very short question. In a sense, when we are dealing with these experiences that we are talking about, in various intersections of the society. So when we are trying to read them, following, Professor Gopal Guru and other people, how to get out of the trope of making them empirical data against the theorization that we are doing from, let's say, the university spaces, which are mostly, as you said, rightly mentioned, that elite spaces. How to get out of that trope and deal with them more sensibly? What is your take on this? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think you've sort of answered your question by invoking Gopal Bhau's language itself. I think Gopal, for many years, and people like Shailaja Paik, like Sharmila Rege, have been arguing for many years that Dalit Bahujan discourses need to work more as a theory or as a vitalization of knowledge rather than as a kind of bickering space of electoral politics, right? So they have been arguing for a dialectical relationship between Dalit and Bahujan rather than what we are seeing now. So I think the kind of mandate to empiricism, right, which, as I said in my talk, it's not something we can give up, because we cannot have rights or representations. And this is the kind of, quagmire, the aporia for many of us, but I think it can be mobilized, as I demonstrated with the caste example of my Samaj, in ways that challenge the demand to say who you are. So I think, Gopal's work, but there is so much, the Dalit Studies reader, there is so much work in Marathi, for example, the language that I am most familiar with, or in Konkani, in Goa, which has a very complicated. So I would say there are so many regional sort of histories and theories of caste that we simply don't read because of the primacy of certain linguistic forms. Now, remember, Hindi, to me, is more sort of primary than English in some of these caste debates, even though the early histories of caste emerge out of Maharashtra, which is not to privilege Maharashtra, but to think about what it means. So I think the Dalit Bahujan nexus needs to be thought more as a dialectic than as a kind of divisive electoral force, which is what is happening now, right? So we hear about Chandrasekhar Azad Ravan, but we don't hear about Hikme Markam or all of these other Adivasi women, because we have fallen into the kind of cult of a kind of masculinist, anti-Dalit, anti-caste politics, which I am saying one needs to be more careful around, right? So it isn't about whether we embrace or refuse empiricism. I think we need to reimagine what are the forms through which we get counted or are made visible, right? I think that's where I did not want to show images of pyres or cremations. I have been horrified by seeing all of those in the news, and it is a deeply disturbing experience for me. Maybe some of you share that. That's why I chose to end with the words of a worker who, of course, was speaking to his disenfranchisement, but also speaking to an enormous caste irony at work, even at this moment of lost lives, right? And remember, this is not to say that crematorium workers are in any way better shape, right? Caste is still making its form sort of at view in these places, as we have seen from reports where people are refusing to allow crematorium workers to sort of cremate their dead because of their caste status, right? But there are moments of rupture, and I think that's what I'm inviting us to think about. I'm inviting us to work with things that are not necessarily comfortable and not necessarily oppositional in any way that we can embrace easily. So I don't have an answer to your question, but I have an incitement for you to think with me about these questions.
So next we have an announcement from Anna. I have to, sorry, there you go.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anjali. That was just a fantastic talk. I wanted to, actually I had a little question, but I wanted to also at this point announce on the talk for next week, which is also on caste and also on sexuality. This is by Professor Anuja Agrawal, considering the peripheries, gendering Indian denotified, semi-nomadic and nomadic communities. So please do sign up for that. Jamaica will give you the details. She'll post it in the chat. I would like to follow up on this issue of, you know, what students are learning about caste in, you know, in universities. And I'm really happy to hear about the movement to try to get caste recognized as a protected characteristic, which it absolutely should be. I'm just wondering how to, I mean, is there a sort of student voice that can be demanding more representation of caste? Because there's a lot of, I mean, I teach in performing arts, and it's only fairly recently that caste has really been raised, and that's in an area where, you know, the majority of performers were actually from oppressed castes, not Brahmins. So that is, it's only in the early 20th century that started to change. So, I mean, I really want to, you know, to work on this, but I would love to have sort of, well, voices of students actually, you know, asking this as well. So it's this sort of, this balance to get. I mean, in my subject, it's still a very, very Brahmanic history, which is dominant and which, you know, foreign researchers have picked up, and Indian researchers are often, you know, deeply immersed in that, performer researchers. So it's still, you know, a big problem. Caste and also religion. If you're talking North India, you've got the issue of religion, Muslim performers as well.
Anna, I don't think that was a question. Yeah, there was a comment, and
how can this, you know, what can be done to help this along? What are your, you know, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts.
First of all, I would like to stay away from the language of help or rescue, or, I mean, I think those are precisely the things we don't want to, you know, caste is not about a restoration of value. It is about an annihilation. So I'm not interested in caste being rescued as a category. I'm interested in thinking about caste as a category that needs to go away, and therefore its protection. I mean, that's how hate speech is organized, right? So I think for students, Anna, the good news is they're the ones mobilizing. As Shiv messaged me and said, was at the Santa Clara Human Rights Commission, what was really evident to me, and especially through the work that I do in caste, anti-caste advocacy, and through the amazing work that Equality Labs does, is the refusal of these mandates is coming from youth, right? I mean, I think I have been saying this for the last 15 years, but I think, you know, because of all of the kind of confluence of progressive movements, the anti-car movements, which were not just in India, but were across the globe, Black Lives Matter, all of these sort of the anti-Asian violence, all of these have sort of really created a sense that the radical possibilities that we yearned for are here and now. And I think that's why what is happening in India is so heartbreaking for so many of us, because what was an enormous movement got shut down by COVID and an authoritarian state. And now people are surviving in conditions of surveillance and censorship in ways that will take a very long time to go. So I say this with, you know, as someone who doesn't live in India anymore, but spends a lot of time there and has too much family and kin, and understands that radical possibility is shrinking. And the challenge for us is, how do we allow for these sorts of spaces where we can still agitate, educate, organize in whatever order. So in solidarity is all I can say.
Well, perhaps if people have things to, you know, links to share and so on, I mean, I would certainly be happy to see anything people have to share and share with students. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. So next question is by Aktas, and then after that will be Kareem.
Hello, thank you so much for your great talk. I learned a lot. My question is about drawing maybe like equivalencies between the identities of trans and Dalit. So in the first video, that we saw, it wasn't clear whether all of the trans people who were speaking in the video were Dalit Bahujan. And considering how many Savarna trans people actually dominate urban LGBT movements in India, how do we make sure that we're not drawing like problematic equivalencies between the identities of Dalit Bahujan and trans, even as we recognize that a lot of trans people, perhaps even the privileged ones, struggle with the lack of covers. And I'm asking this question because in my personal community work, I struggle with making my South Asian community recognize how homophobia and transphobia is rooted in Brahminical patriarchy, but at the same time, I don't want to collapse the identity of trans into Dalit or allow Savarna trans people to appropriate Dalit resistance language. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. And I think that's why I put the two videos together, right? Because even though the first video is sort of obviously about trans challenges around paper histories, the second video also had a lot of queer trans people in the audience. We just didn't recognize them or see them in the same way, right? So I think part of the challenge about thinking about trans Dalit as substitutive, they're not fungible for me, right? Trans is not always Dalit and Dalit is not always progressive, right? So I think part of what I'm trying to do, and that's why for me, the history of the Samaj, the one that I have been working on, have finished, has become a very useful place, right? The Gomantat Maratha Samaj is in many ways, an organization, a community that is incredibly disfranchised, and 50% of its communities live below the poverty line in various places in Goa, Karnataka, and Maharashtra, but they're also incredibly privileged, right? The first chief minister of Goa was Dayanand Bandorkar, who was a member of this community, but was a lower caste capitalist. Right. So part of what I'm trying to do by suturing, and that's why I said this is a video of an urban trans, and urban is always code for a certain caste formation, right? Particularly if you think about Delhi, right? So I think what I was trying to do by putting those together is sort of speak to how those two collectivities were articulating their dis-ease with the mandate for paper, and what we can learn and not learn from both those forms, right? And I think the other point is that there is a segregation between people who do anti-caste work and people who do queer trans work, right? And part of the challenge for us is to constantly remind people that those segregations are created by the monetization of the state around certain categories, right? Why are we allowed? So for example, the famous example that I use is of course of the queer march that happened in Mumbai against the CAA, where there were Dalit and folks who had banners for Kashmiri Azadi, who were then arrested for anti-national acts, but the march was continued to go on, right? So part of what I was trying to do with those two videos is sort of speak about the need to have multiple publics within a category, and those publics may not necessarily cohere in any form that is necessarily and safely oppositional, right? So I think the fact that some trans activists are casteist is an important point that we need to keep making. So also we need to keep making the point, like we did at the Santa Clara Human Rights Mission, where we had some Dalit kin who said, this is nonsense, caste doesn't exist, right? Those are also voices that we need to be able to engage with. So I think my sort of commitment is to creating a vocabulary where we can think all of these things as non-competitive. Right, that if we want to forge ahead with the progressive politics, we have to be able to think of them as having value. And how do we create a value chain that allows us to have different idioms of the possible? But your question is an important one, and I think we need to keep asking it, right? Especially because there's also the question of language, English, et cetera, which many people have been talking about. But thank you for that question.
The next question is from Kareem.
Hi, Anjali, and hi also from Gauri. We were struck. Well, one, thank you for what was a really beautiful and thoughtful presentation. We were both really struck by the ethnographic anecdote about the banner And it just sort of, it opened up the kind of interdisciplinarity of the work that you're doing. You started with poetry and then media, ethnographic anecdotes and archive. And I'm just wondering, I wanted to ask about the sort of scope of this new project, the importance of multimodal research and interdisciplinarity in your approach and what that's opening up for you as you think about documentation and surveillance.
Kareem, that is a very hard question, and a big salam to Gauri. Gauri, I wanted to show the banner, which was in Kannada, and you would have been one of the few people who would have been able to read it. But for some reason, I couldn't pull it up. So Kareem, I think you're giving me more credit than I deserve. I do not work in media. I used the media because I was very conscious of the moment we are in. I wanted to use this presentation as a place of sanctuary and remembrance. So that is why I wanted people to remember the fury of those moments of Car, of the protest against Car that was so wondrous and full of possibility, and to remember that those are there somewhere, behind this dark curtain that covers us all. So in my book, I do work with interdisciplinary forms, but my relationship to those interdisciplinary forms are that they become disciplinary through the organization of the colonial archive, meaning what is poetry one day is history another, what is a biography one day becomes an archival record another. So what I do in my book is work with different archival genres to speak to the fact that they're all staged in ways to codify and datify our historical moments. So for example, the Samaj that I work in has refused to digitalize its archives, as I've said in various moments. And the refusal is not because of a lack of resources, because they're not invested in a lineage of loss. Digitalization means that there is a lineage of loss. They are invested in continuation and reproduction without preservation, right? So you're invited, any one of you can go to the Samaj archives and read the materials. The materials may not be there the next day or they may be destroyed, but the idea of the Samaj will continue. And to me, that's exhilarating, right? It's exhilarating because it provides a different sightline for communion. And it also goes back to what the poem I began with, the Kaka poem, right? Which says, we don't want to fulfill our content within the archival forms that have strangleholded us to begin with, right? So how can we pull a fast one like the Samaj does, but also because we want to learn. They pick Saraswati, right? Which is very important. So there are many ways to attend to your question. I think your work, Gauri's wonderful new book, all of you, I think, do this much more elegantly than I do. I think I write mostly about dead archives, but this project has made me think about talking to real life people in ways that are both frightening and exciting. So thank you.
Anjali, so I know we're a bit over time, but do you mind if we have a couple more questions?
No, not at all.
Okay,
not at all.
great. So Purnima has the next question. If I can find her to unmute her.
I'm unmuted.
Oh, there you are. Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Anjali, for that fantastic talk. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about your invocation of abundance and what kinds of analytical and political possibilities that holds. I really appreciate your doing that, but I'd love to hear more about your thought process in getting to abundance as an analytic.
Thank you, Purnima, for that question. I didn't belabor it too much because I've given too many talks at your center and I talked about abundance the last time I was there, but I'm happy to say more. The idea of abundance that I'm putting forward is not one of literality. It's not about there is more, but more about sort of radical imaginaries that allow us to revisit the same critical object in multiple iterations, right? So it's a practice of reading. Now, I was invested in this practice of reading because those of us who work on minoritized histories are always asked to show and tell, right? And as I say this over and over again, this is something that many scholars who I've learned from and keep company with in indigenous studies, slavery studies, Dalit studies, have been saying for a very long time, right? That we refuse to produce evidence of our existence. Instead, we want to think more radically about other forms of archival arrival, right? So that's why I began by describing this project as a refusal of lineages of loss as the origin story from where we begin. So the idea of abundance, so it's not just that this archive, which I've been working on for the last 15 years, I've only read 50% of it because there is so much. But I'm not saying that you need to find material archives which are so much in order to theorize abundance. Abundance is also for me a refusal of devaluation, which is the form through which we think about histories of minoritization. So to say abundance within the subaltern context is to begin with a different value chain, right? To assume that there is no paucity, but that there is beginnings of different varieties. Now, let me be clear, on this audience, this will not happen, but usually some curmudgeon white liberal will say to me, Anjali, are you saying there's no loss in South Asia? That is absolutely not what I'm saying. As I have said over and over and again, loss is the ordinary syncopation of life in South Asia. What I'm trying to say is, how do people mobilize in pragmatic and wondrously imaginative ways, forms of survival that allow them to script their own histories? And I think that's why, and this is true for a lot of minoritized communities. Every time I've given this versions of the book or whatever in places, people will always come up to me saying, you know, we know this archive, or we know these materials. And so it is more familiar than unfamiliar, right? So it is really a commitment to inventing new habits of historical reading, which I think can spread across ethnographic practices, etc. But I will stick to historical practices and leave the ethnography to your expertise, Purnima. So, but thank you.
Thanks. I'm really appreciative of your of what you said, especially since I missed your previous talks at the center. But yeah, I get that what you're saying is not about adding more evidence that would go totally against the spirit of your talk and everything that you've said. And what I'm hearing you say is to really kind of point to the eruptive potential of, and potentiality really, of abundance. So thanks.
So Anjali, we have a question from Ali Imran, who says that they can't speak from where they are, but I'm just going to read the question out loud. As someone from the other side of the border, Pakistani Punjab, I see caste around me operate in a more sinister, more muted way. Can you maybe speak on how you see the visibility or invisibility of caste and sexuality operate in spaces, elitist, oppressive, etc., where these narratives are at present seen as foreign or part of a foregone past?
That's an excellent question. And Salam Ali, I'm not sure if we met in Lahore, but if not, it's good to hear your written voice. That's a question that my comrade and colleague Shaista Patel, who teaches at UC San Diego, can speak more eloquently too. But I have learned from her work and from my own work in Pakistan to say that one of the challenges of talking about caste, and I think this is what the diaspora has been better about, is to speak about caste as not a Hindu problem. Right? I think that has been the biggest challenge. And so that's why I showed that video from Jamshedpur, which my comrade Khalid Ansari, who writes about Pasmanda Muslims, had posted on social media, because part of the challenge has been is that caste has been tied primarily to a kind of Hindu-centric theological modality, of which, of course, it is part. But caste is present in South Asia in all kinds of ways that are articulated through projects of inequity. So, for example, if you go to Goa, I don't want to exceptionalize the Muslim, which is where people tend to go all the time. But if you go to places like Pakistan, for example, in Karachi, where there are many members of the Goan community who migrated previous to partition, anyone you meet will say, I am a Brahmin Christian, or I am a Kshatriya Christian. What does that mean? There have been 250 years since conversion, but caste identity has not gone away, right? So Ali, to answer your question, I would say that it is less about sort of saying it's not foreign, but sort of speaking to the kind of histories that exist within Pakistan itself, right? Because of histories of migration, histories of region, where this becomes not an Indian problem, right? But in fact, a problem of inequity and labor segmentation, right? Those are the 2 points that I would say. And the good news for you, Ali, is that there are all of these wonderful Pakistani scholars who have been talking about many of these questions, and one can learn from them and collaborate with them as we think across borders. There are also people in Bangladesh talking about questions of caste, in Sri Lanka, in many different areas. And I think this was the way in which it was argued in the diaspora, in the commission, where we tried to think about caste as a category. We wanted to think about it across religions and across regions, right? That it's not an India problem. Migrants carry caste privilege, right? So you don't have to be in India, you don't even have to be born in India, you don't have to speak a single language, you still have caste privilege. I can't tell you how I still get asked what my surname is, and then there is usually some kind of response to the surname, which is, to my mind, absurd at this stage in my life, but it happens, right? So it's worth thinking about what those conversations can be. So Ali, thank you, Shukriya, for your question, and I hope we get to be with each other again sometime soon.
So I thought I might take the privilege of hosting to ask you one final question, which is building on Purnima's question about abundance and what abundance means and what's at stake in abundance. In a way, what I want to ask you is, what is the mode of abundance, right? What is the mode of historical inquiry required to find abundance? Because from what I heard you saying, it's not about there being an archive that is in fact copious or beyond measure, but it's a kind of mode of approach or a mode of inquiry. So how would you describe what that mode of inquiry looks like? I'm thinking about your first book, right? But also thinking about the kind of vast literature in post-colonial studies, looking at things, trying to look, trying to read the archive, in between the lines, going with the grain, against the grain. There's all these metaphors of how to approach the archive, right? So how do you approach an archive such that it becomes abundant in a way that doesn't already imply loss, right? Because in some sense, I think when you have to read kind of against the archive or against the grain of the archive, you're already assuming that there's already a loss there, right? Or loss is kind of fundamental in some sense.
Bharat, that's an excellent question, and in fact is the topic of one chapter of my book, which is called A History I Am Not Writing. And the way I would respond is that that's why this project for me is more queer than my first book, which was ostensibly about queer bodies in very literal ways, because it was about homosexuality. In many ways, this book is more queer for me because the theorization of abundance that I am trying to summon is about a non-recuperative historical practice, which is a queer project, right? Which is that we turn to archival fragments or archival traces, not to extract value, but to disseminate its form. Right? That's the abundant form. Because one of the mandates, particularly of minoritized historiography, is that you accrue value, you create meaning through the plenitude of your hermeneutics, right? That you make meaning. So writing against the grain, along the grain, with the grain, surface reading, all of them are about instrumentalizing, mobilizing a trace to accrue meaning. What I'm interested in thinking about is what is it that the archival trace cannot hold? Not what it holds, right? So the cannot holding allows us to move towards an efflorescence, a kind of mobilization of meanings that cannot be extracted and stabilized as historical value, right? So that's why I link the question of abundance very directly to the question of subaltern history, right? Because those histories begin as histories of loss and histories of devaluation. And what I'm saying is, that's why I said to Anna, it's not about restoration, right? It's about inventing new value chains, about saying, let's think about how we accrue value, how we create meaning. And what happens if meaning is not about reproduction, right? Or restoration, but is about non-recuperation, meaning you read not to hold on, but to let go. that is the kind of hermeneutics that I'm trying to offer. You'll just have to read the book now.
And can you tell us when the book will be out?
Well, hopefully by the end of the year or
Okay, fantastic.
January 2021. So
Great.
the pandemic has made many of these things difficult, but hopefully by the end of the year.
Wonderful. So now everyone knows to keep an eye out for the book, which will be out hopefully end of the year or early next year. And so Anjali, thank you so much for coming to join us virtually. Hopefully next time we'll be in person. And thank you to all of you for joining us as well. Jamaica has asked me to just let everyone know that you'll receive an email about our next speaker, as well as with the links that Anjali shared with us for organizations doing COVID-related work on the ground. So we will see you all next time. Anjali, thank you again.
Thank you, and Jai Bhim.